Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of the Oklahoma Territory. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing which places and what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. In April 1912, as an unseasonable heatwave gripped the dusty railroad town of Lawton, a sight both wondrous and ominous appeared on the horizon. The Whitfield brothers' traveling carnival arrived with great fanfare, their colorful wagons and elaborate equipment transforming the barren outskirts of town into what promised to be a realm of entertainment and amazement. Local newspaper editor Samuel Grimes meticulously documented the carnival's arrival in the Lawton Gazette, noting the efficiency with which the workers erected tents and assembled mechanical attractions under the scorching Sunday. The brothers themselves, Cornelius Whitfield, aged 52, and his younger sibling Mordecai, 48, presented as refined showmen from Missouri, their well-tailored suits and educated speech setting them apart from the typical carnival operators who passed through the territory. They supervised the setup with practiced precision, directing workers with an authority that suggested years of experience in the traveling entertainment business. Yet even in these early hours, something seemed amiss to the more observant townspeople. Among the standard carnival equipment was a railway car that remained conspicuously sealed throughout the entire setup process, its doors secured with heavy chains and multiple padlocks that seemed excessive for mere theatrical equipment. Workers gave the car a wide berth, and when questioned about its contents, they would only shake their heads and mutter about special exhibitions that required careful handling. The brothers had also brought with them what they advertised as an extraordinary collection of human curiosities, though the exact nature of these attractions remained mysteriously vague in their promotional materials. As the sun set on that first day, casting long shadows across the carnival grounds, few could have imagined that this seemingly festive arrival marked the beginning of a nightmare that would forever scar the community and expose a horror beyond the comprehension of decent folk. A systematic operation of abduction and murder disguised behind the cheerful facade of canvas and bright lights. The anticipation that gripped Lawton in the days following the carnival's arrival was palpable, spreading through the community like wildfire on the dry prairie grass. The carnival's advance man, a smooth-talking gentleman named Theodore Marsh, had arrived days earlier to distribute handbills throughout the town, each one promising wonders beyond imagination and mysteries of the human form never before revealed to the public eye. These colorful advertisements appeared in every shop window, saloon, and public building, their bold typography and exotic illustrations capturing the imagination of a population hungry for entertainment in their isolated corner of the territory. Families began planning their weekend visits, children saved their pennies for games and sweets, and even the most stoic ranchers expressed curiosity about what mysteries the Whitfield brothers might unveil. The key figures of Lawton's respectable society took notice as well, including Sheriff Marcus Webb, a former Texas Ranger who had brought law to many a lawless frontier town, schoolteacher Eleanor Morrison, whose sharp intellect and concern for her students made her a pillar of the community, and Dr. Jonathan Hayes, the town's only physician, whose medical training at Johns Hopkins had prepared him for prairie ailments, but not for what he would soon encounter. As preparations continued and the carnival took shape, strange incidents began to multiply across town. Ranchers reported their normally placid livestock becoming agitated when the wind carried sounds from the carnival grounds, horses refusing to be ridden in that direction, and cattle bellowing anxiously through the night. More disturbing still were the reactions of the town's dogs, typically eager to investigate any new arrival, which now refused to venture anywhere near the midway, whimpering and pulling against their leads when their owners attempted to walk them past. Mrs. Adelaide Perkins, whose boarding house overlooked the carnival grounds, complained of an unusual odor carried on the evening breeze, describing it as sweet, yet somehow corrupt, like flowers left too long in a tomb. These early warning signs, dismissed by most as coincidence or the natural wariness of animals toward unfamiliar sights and sounds, would later be recognized as the first hints of the horror that traveled with the Whitfield brothers' seemingly innocent entertainment enterprise. Opening night arrived with all the spectacle and excitement the handbills had promised, as hundreds of Lawton's citizens streamed through the Carnival's ornate entrance arch, their faces illuminated by strings of electric bulbs that transformed the dusty field into a glittering wonderland. The midway stretched before them like a street in some fantastic city, lined with game booths where barkers challenged visitors to test their skill, food vendors offering exotic treats, and mechanical amusements that whirred and clanked with promises of thrills. The Hall of Mirrors drew laughing crowds who delighted in their distorted reflections, while the fortune-teller's tent, draped in deep purple silk and mysterious symbols, attracted those seeking glimpses of their future. At the center of it all stood the main exhibition tent, where Cornelius and Mordecai Whitfield personally introduced their traveling museum of human oddities with the practiced showmanship of veteran performers. They guided audiences past glass cases containing what they claimed were authentic medical specimens, preserved limbs showing rare deformities, and skeletons demonstrating various pathological conditions, all presented with pseudo-scientific explanations that impressed the layfolk while causing Dr. Hayes to furrow his brow in professional skepticism. The live performers were introduced with great flourish, men and women whose physical differences were displayed as educational curiosities. Though Hayes noticed troubling inconsistencies between the conditions the brothers claimed these individuals possessed and what his medical training told him he was actually observing. The evening's festivities took a darker turn when young Sarah Fletcher, age 7, disappeared for nearly an hour while her parents enjoyed the ring toss game. She was found eventually near the sealed railway car, crying and unable to explain where she had been, saying only that the thin man had shown her sleeping dolls before her father's voice had called her back. Her parents, relieved to have her safely returned, dismissed her story as the overactive imagination of a child overwhelmed by the Carnival's sensory assault. But Sheriff Webb made a mental note of the incident, particularly the detail about the sealed car that workers continued to avoid with suspicious consistency. As the night wore on and the crowds began to thin, Dr. Hayes lingered, his medical curiosity piqued by questions that would soon lead him down a path darker than any carnival midway. The first rays of Sunday morning sunshine did nothing to dispel the shadow that fell across Lawton when Florence Hartwell arrived at the sheriff's office, her face drawn with worry and her hands clutching a worn photograph of her son Timothy, age 14, who had failed to return home after visiting the carnival the previous evening. According to his friends, young Timothy had been particularly interested in seeing the private exhibition, adults only, tent that several teenagers claimed to have spotted behind the main midway. Though when Sheriff Webb questioned the Whitfield brothers about such an attraction, they expressed complete bewilderment, insisting their carnival had no adult-only exhibitions and suggesting that local youth might be spreading tales to impress one another. The sheriff's investigation began immediately, with deputies searching the carnival grounds while workers went about their morning routines of feeding animals and maintaining equipment, their cooperation seemingly genuine, but tinged with a nervousness that Webb's experienced eye didn't miss. Timothy's scattered belongings were discovered near the railway yard, his cap caught on a fence post and his pocket knife lying in the dust, its blade still open as if he had been interrupted while using it. The positioning of these items suggested not a boy who had wandered off on an adventure, but one who had encountered something unexpected and potentially threatening. Cornelius Whitfield, maintaining his composure with practiced ease, suggested that young boys often became enamored with carnival life and attempted to run away with the show, presenting statistics about such occurrences that seemed rehearsed rather than spontaneous. He offered the full cooperation of his staff in the search, though Webb noticed how his brother Mordecai's eyes darted nervously toward the sealed railway car whenever it was mentioned. The carnival continued its operations despite the investigation, the cheerful music and barker calls creating a surreal contrast to the growing dread in Florence Hartwell's heart as each hour passed without word of her son. By nightfall, with no trace of Timothy beyond his abandoned possessions, the first seeds of suspicion began to take root in the minds of Lawton's citizens, though none yet imagined the true horror that had befallen the boy, or the systematic nature of the evil that had come to their town disguised as family entertainment. As Monday morning dawned, with Timothy Hartwell still missing, Eleanor Morrison took it upon herself to organize a proper search party. her natural leadership and genuine concern for her students, galvanizing the community into action where official channels seemed to be moving too slowly. She divided volunteers into groups, assigning them sections of the surrounding countryside to search, while maintaining detailed records of areas covered and any findings, no matter how seemingly insignificant. Sheriff Webb, meanwhile, focused his investigation on the carnival itself, conducting systematic interviews with every worker he could find, from the grizzled roustabouts who assembled the tents to the performers who entertained the crowds. Most appeared genuinely ignorant of Timothy's whereabouts, expressing sympathy for the worried mother and concern for their own reputations, but several exhibited peculiar behaviors when questioned about certain aspects of the carnival's operations, particularly anything involving the sealed railway car that continued to squat like a malevolent presence at the edge of the grounds. One young worker named Billy Crenshaw seemed especially nervous, his hands trembling as he insisted he knew nothing about any private exhibitions or special shows, though his eyes betrayed a fear that went beyond mere concern about losing his job. Dr. Hayes, applying his scientific training to the investigation, conducted a thorough examination of Timothy's recovered belongings and made a discovery that elevated his concern from professional interest to genuine alarm. Using his medical supplies and knowledge of chemistry, he identified traces of an unusual compound on the boy's cap, a mixture containing chloroform but also other substances he couldn't immediately identify, suggesting a more sophisticated sedative than common criminals might employ. The doctor shared his findings with Sheriff Webb privately, both men agreeing to keep this information from the general public to avoid panic while they pursued leads. As the search parties returned empty-handed and another night fell with Timothy still missing, the carnival's bright lights seemed less inviting to the townspeople, and the laughter from the midway took on a hollow, mocking quality. The Whitfield brothers maintained their facade of concerned cooperation, but careful observers noted how they had begun to supervise their workers more closely, and how certain areas of the carnival grounds were now off-limits, even to paying customers, protected by burly men whose cold eyes suggested they were more than simple carnival security. The investigation took a chilling turn when Sheriff Webb's telegraph inquiries to lawmen in neighboring states began yielding responses that painted a disturbing pattern across the frontier. From Wichita came word of two missing adolescents who had vanished during the Whitfield Carnival's visit 6 weeks prior. From Little Rock, a report of a young woman who had disappeared after being seen entering the carnival grounds alone, and from Joplin, Missouri, accounts of 3 separate disappearances over the single week the carnival had been in town. Each report shared similar characteristics with Timothy Hartwell's case: young people last seen at or near the carnival, personal items found scattered but no bodies discovered, and local investigations that had been stymied by lack of evidence and the carnival's rapid departure. Sheriff Webb compiled these reports into a timeline that revealed an horrific truth that the Whitfield brothers' traveling carnival left a trail of missing persons stretching back at least 18 months through Kansas, Arkansas, and Missouri. The numbers were staggering: at least 23 confirmed disappearances directly connected to the carnival's visits, with possibly more that hadn't been formally reported or connected to the traveling show. Local newspaper editor Samuel Grimes, sensing a story that went far beyond typical small-town news, began his own investigation into the Whitfield brothers' background, discovering troubling inconsistencies in their claimed history. The brothers presented themselves as inheritors of a family carnival tradition dating back to the 1882nd, but Grimes could find no record of any Whitfield family in the carnival business before 1905. Further investigation revealed that several long-time carnival workers had been replaced recently, with explanations that they had moved on to other opportunities or returned home for family matters, though none of these former employees could be located for questioning. The new workers all seemed to share certain characteristics. They were mostly drifters, with no family connections, eager for work and unlikely to be missed if they too eventually moved on. This pattern of employee turnover, combined with the trail of disappearances, suggested an operation far more sinister than simple kidnapping, one that had been perfected over time and executed with a professionalism that made Sheriff Webb suspect the Whitfield brothers were not merely criminals, but something far worse, predators who had turned human hunting into a grotesque business model hidden behind the cheerful facade of family entertainment. As darkness fell on the third night since Timothy Hartwell's disappearance, the citizens of Lawton reported increasingly disturbing incidents emanating from the carnival grounds during the hours when the midway should have been silent and still. Multiple witnesses described strange mechanical sounds that seemed to come from beneath the ground rather than from any visible structure, a rhythmic thumping and grinding that suggested heavy equipment in operation, punctuated by what some swore were muffled human voices, though the distance and intervening noise made it impossible to discern actual words. Mrs. Perkins, watching from her boarding-house window with the vigilance of the genuinely frightened, observed figures moving between the wagons with purposeful stealth, carrying what appeared to be long, wrapped bundles that required 2 men to transport. Deputy William Foster, a young but dedicated lawman who had earned Webb's trust through years of reliable service, volunteered to investigate these nocturnal activities alone, reasoning that a single man might observe more while attracting less attention than a full patrol. His investigation on that fog-shrouded night would prove to be both revealing and fatal, though the full extent of his discoveries wouldn't be known until morning when his riderless horse returned to the sheriff's office, its saddle askew and Foster's rifle still in its scabbard. The search for the missing deputy began at first light, with Sheriff Webb personally leading a team that included several armed volunteers who had begun to view the carnival less as entertainment and more as a threat to their community. Foster's badge was discovered in the fortune-teller's tent, placed almost ceremoniously in the center of the crystal ball table, its presence there feeling more like a taunt than a clue. Of Foster himself there was no sign, though careful examination of the ground near the sealed railway car revealed signs of a struggle, scuff marks in the dirt, a torn piece of uniform fabric caught on a nail, and several dark stains that Dr. Hayes confirmed were human blood. The excavation equipment that Foster had apparently discovered before his disappearance was nowhere to be found, though fresh wheel tracks suggested heavy wagons had been moved during the night. The Whitfield brothers expressed shock and concern at the deputy's disappearance, offering their full cooperation and even suggesting that Foster might have encountered dangerous vagrants who sometimes followed carnivals, preying on both the shows and their patrons. Their performance of innocent concern might have been convincing had Sheriff Webb not noticed Mordecai Whitfield unconsciously rubbing a fresh scratch on his hand while speaking, a wound that looked suspiciously like it might have been inflicted by a lawman's badge during a struggle in the dark. Dr. Jonathan Hayes made his most significant discovery while providing medical treatment to a carnival worker named Ernst Zimmerman, who had suffered a severe laceration while maintaining one of the mechanical rides and required immediate attention to prevent dangerous blood loss. As Hayes cleaned and sutured the wound in his office, he noticed unusual scarring on Zimmerman's torso that his medical training immediately recognized as surgical in nature, but unlike any therapeutic procedure he had encountered in legitimate medical practice. The scars suggested exploratory surgery conducted without regard for the patient's recovery or cosmetic outcome, as if the operator had been more interested in observation than treatment. When Zimmerman became delirious from the laudanum administered for pain, his fevered ramblings provided a window into horrors that made the doctor's blood run cold. The man spoke in broken English mixed with German, describing the collection that grows with each town and specimens that weren't meant to survive the harvest, his words painting a picture of medical experimentation conducted on unwilling subjects. He mentioned the cutting room beneath, and spoke of screams muffled by earth and canvas, of bodies transformed from living beings into preserved curiosities for purposes that defied both medical ethics and human decency. Hayes documented every word in his personal journal, his physician's training to record observations, overcoming his mounting horror at what he was hearing. When Zimmerman's delirium passed and consciousness returned, he claimed no memory of his utterances, but the terror in his eyes when Hayes gently questioned him about the surgical scars suggested memories all too vivid. The doctor's subsequent investigation of the carnival revealed medical equipment far more sophisticated than any traveling show should possess, including surgical instruments, preservation chemicals, and specialized containers designed for transporting biological specimens. Hidden among legitimate medical supplies for treating performer injuries, Hayes found evidence of procedures that belonged more in a gothic horror tale than in any legitimate medical practice. His growing certainty that the Whitfield brothers were conducting some form of human experimentation was reinforced when he discovered a partial inventory list that included measurements and physical descriptions matching some of the missing persons from other towns. The doctor faced an agonizing decision whether to continue gathering evidence at personal risk or to immediately share his discoveries with Sheriff Webb, knowing that premature revelation might allow the perpetrators to escape justice or destroy evidence of their crimes. Eleanor Morrison's decision to infiltrate the Carnival workforce came from a combination of desperation to find Timothy Hartwell and her recognition that the investigation needed someone on the inside who could move freely without arousing suspicion among the increasingly wary Carnival workers. She presented herself at the Carnival office as a widow seeking temporary employment, her educated demeanor and respectable appearance making her an ideal candidate for ticket sales and cash handling, positions that would allow her to observe both the public face of the operation and potentially glimpse its hidden workings. Mordecai Whitfield interviewed her personally, his questions probing but ultimately satisfied by her carefully constructed story of recent bereavement and financial necessity. Within hours of beginning her masquerade, Eleanor began to understand the complex hierarchy and unspoken rules that governed Carnival life, noting which workers moved freely throughout the grounds and which were confined to specific areas, which conversations flowed naturally and which were cut short by warning glances. She observed that certain long-time employees, particularly those who had been with the show for more than a year, shared a haunted quality in their expressions, as if they carried knowledge that weighed upon their souls, but dared not speak of it, even among themselves. Through careful cultivation of relationships with other female workers, Eleanor learned of a special show that the Whitfield brothers occasionally conducted for select audiences in certain towns, private exhibitions that commanded extraordinary fees from attendees who were carefully vetted before being admitted. These events were spoken of only in whispers and always with a note of revulsion mixed with fear, though no one would provide specific details about what transpired during these exclusive presentations. The ticket seller who had worked the previous special show in Joplin had left the Carnival immediately afterward, claiming family emergency but leaving behind most of her belongings in her haste to depart. Eleanor documented everything in a journal she kept hidden in her boarding house room, using a simple code she had developed for her personal correspondence, knowing that discovery of her true purpose could lead to her joining Timothy Hartwell and Deputy Foster among the missing. Her most valuable source of information proved to be Martha Chen, a fortune-teller who had been with various carnivals for decades and possessed the ability to see through facades that fooled others. Martha's hints and warnings, delivered in the guise of casual conversation, guided Eleanor toward areas of investigation, while also making it clear that some knowledge came with a price that might be paid in blood rather than coin. The investigation reached a crucial breakthrough when railroad worker James Brennan approached Sheriff Webb with information that his conscience would no longer allow him to suppress. Brennan, a family man with 3 young children of his own, had been troubled by irregularities he'd observed regarding the sealed railway car that traveled with the Whitfield brothers' Carnival. As an experienced freight handler, he was familiar with weight distributions and cargo manifests, and something about this particular car had bothered him since its arrival. The manifest consistently listed the contents as theatrical equipment and carnival supplies, but Brennan's practiced eye told him the weight was distributed all wrong for such materials, concentrating in specific areas rather than spread evenly as crates of equipment would be. More disturbing were the sounds he had heard during loading and unloading operations, sounds that didn't match machinery or supplies, but suggested something else entirely, something that occasionally moved or shifted despite supposedly being inanimate cargo. His supervisor, Brennan revealed, had received substantial payments from the Whitfield brothers to ensure no questions were asked and no inspections were conducted. Money that bought silence, but couldn't purchase peace of mind for those who suspected what might be hidden within that sealed metal tomb. Brennan produced documentation he had secretly copied, showing discrepancies between reported weights and actual measurements, variations that suggested the car's contents changed significantly between stops, sometimes gaining weight, sometimes losing it. in patterns that made no sense for legitimate theatrical equipment. He also provided Sheriff Webb with shipping schedules that revealed the car's ultimate destinations, including frequent deliveries to a Dr. Magnus Crow in Chicago, shipments that were always marked as urgent and requiring special handling. The railway workers' decision to come forward had been precipitated by overhearing Cornelius Whitfield discussing the need to process the recent acquisitions quickly, and mentioning that the Chicago buyer grows impatient for fresh specimens. These words, combined with the disappearances plaguing Lawton, had overcome Brennan's fear of retribution and his supervisor's threats. Sheriff Webb, recognizing the significance of this testimony, arranged for Brennan and his family to be relocated to relatives in Colorado for their safety while he prepared to act on this new evidence. The sealed railway car had transformed from a mysterious oddity to the potential key for understanding the full scope of the Whitfield brothers' crimes, though accessing its contents would require careful planning and substantial legal authority to overcome the protections the brothers had purchased through bribery and intimidation. Eleanor Morrison's investigation reached its dangerous climax when she successfully gained access to Mordecai Whitfield's personal quarters, using the trust she had carefully cultivated and a forged message about urgent financial discrepancies that required immediate attention to the Carnival's account books. The private railway car that served as the brothers' living quarters and office was a study in contradictions, its public areas decorated with the gaudy opulence expected of successful showmen, while concealed compartments revealed documentation of unspeakable crimes. Behind false panels and within locked drawers that Eleanor opened using skills learned from a locksmith's daughter at school, she discovered correspondence that confirmed the worst suspicions about the Carnival's true purpose. Letters from Dr. Magnus Crow in Chicago discussed procurement specifications for anatomical specimens of particular uniqueness, with detailed requirements about age, physical condition, and preservation methods that made it clear these were not legitimate medical school cadavers, but murdered victims selected for specific characteristics. The most damning discovery was a leather-bound ledger hidden within a hollowed-out book, its pages filled with meticulous records that transformed human lives into inventory entries. Each line contained a name or description, the date and location of acquisition, physical measurements and notable features, the method of processing, and finally, the profit derived from the sale of what the ledger termed materials. The entries stretched back years and across multiple states, revealing a network of murder and body trafficking that had claimed dozens of victims. Timothy Hartwell's name appeared in the most recent entries, marked as pending processing, which gave Eleanor desperate hope that he might still be alive. She found correspondence discussing expansion plans, mentions of other operations running similar acquisition programs in different regions, and references to buyers beyond Dr. Crow who paid premium prices for specific types of specimens. Payment records showed enormous sums flowing through accounts in multiple cities, evidence of a thriving trade in human bodies that operated beneath the cheerful surface of American entertainment. Eleanor carefully copied the most crucial pages, knowing that the originals must remain in place to avoid alerting the brothers to her discovery, her hands shaking as she transcribed evidence of crimes that challenged comprehension. A noise outside the car forced her to quickly restore everything to its original position and exit through a window, her heart pounding as she clutched the copied documents that would either bring justice or make her the next name in that horrible ledger. She made her way back to town under cover of darkness, the weight of her discoveries making every shadow a potential threat, and every footstep behind her a possible pursuer. The horrifying discoveries continued when Sheriff Webb, acting on information from multiple sources and armed with evidence that could no longer be ignored, led a secret excavation beneath the Carnival grounds, where Deputy Foster's investigation had noted disturbed earth. Working by lamplight in the pre-dawn hours with a select team of trusted men, they uncovered a temporary underground chamber that revealed the mechanical nature of the Whitfield brothers' killing operation. The space, approximately 12 feet square and 7 feet deep, had been expertly constructed with timber supports and waterproof lining, designed for rapid assembly and disassembly as the Carnival moved from town to town. Iron rings bolted to support posts showed where victims had been restrained, while grooves in the floor indicated the placement of examination tables and other equipment. The walls bore scratch marks at various heights, silent testimony to the desperation of those who had been held there, and dark stains on the timber that Dr. Hayes confirmed were human blood of varying ages, suggested this chamber had been reconstructed in numerous locations over the years. Photographs discovered in a waterproof container showed similar setups in different locations, each carefully documented with notes about improvements and modifications, revealing an evolution of design that spoke to years of refining their terrible craft. Medical instruments found cached in hidden compartments included bone saws, scalpels, and preservation equipment, along with chemicals for embalming and specimen preparation that matched those Dr. Hayes had noted in his investigation. Most disturbing was a logbook detailing processing procedures that read like a manual for efficient corpse production, with time estimates, tool requirements, and notes about maximizing the value of each victim through careful dismemberment and preservation. The chamber included drainage systems for bodily fluids and ventilation shafts that could be disguised as ordinary carnival equipment stakes, showing a level of planning that transformed murder from crime of passion to industrial process. Sheriff Webb's men, hardened frontier lawmen who had seen their share of violence, found themselves sickened by the clinical efficiency of the killing chamber, its very existence proof that the Whitfield brothers had transformed human predation into a business model that traveled from town to town, leaving grief and empty graves in its wake. The evidence was carefully documented and photographed before the first rays of sunlight reached the carnival grounds, providing incontrovertible proof of the systematic nature of the crimes, while also raising the urgent question of where the current victims, including Timothy Hartwell and Deputy Foster, might be held if not in this temporarily abandoned chamber. Dr. Hayes's medical investigation reached its shocking climax when he gained access to the restricted exhibition area where the carnival's preserved curiosities were stored between public viewings. What he discovered there challenged every principle of medical ethics and human decency he had sworn to uphold as a physician. The specimens, presented to the public as historical medical curiosities or examples of rare conditions, showed signs under close examination that revealed their true nature as recently deceased victims who had been subjected to post-mortem modifications. Using his medical training, Hayes identified evidence of deliberate surgical alterations designed to create the appearance of natural deformities or medical conditions, transformations that turned murdered individuals into profitable exhibitions. Some specimens showed signs of chemical preservation techniques that were far too advanced for the dates claimed on their labels, while others exhibited trauma patterns consistent with the restraint marks found in the underground chamber. His investigation led to a concealed workshop behind the main exhibition area, where bodies were being prepared for shipment or display, equipped with embalming tables, surgical instruments, and preservation chemicals that would have been at home in a medical school anatomy laboratory, if not for their horrific purpose. It was here that Hayes made his most crucial discovery, when he found Timothy Hartwell, still alive but heavily sedated, strapped to an examination table with surgical marks, indicating he was being prepared for some special purpose. The boy's pulse was weak but steady, his breathing shallow from the effects of whatever cocktail of drugs had been administered to keep him compliant. Nearby, Hayes discovered Deputy Foster in a similar state, along with 2 other recent victims he didn't recognize, all being kept in a state of suspended animation while awaiting their turn for processing. The doctor worked frantically to document the scene while also preparing doses of stimulants that might counteract the sedatives, knowing that any attempt at rescue would need to be coordinated with Sheriff Webb to prevent the Whitfield brothers from executing their captives rather than allowing them to be freed. Notes found in the workshop revealed that these particular victims had been selected for a special order from Dr. Crow, who had requested living specimens for vivisection demonstrations at a private medical conference, adding a new dimension of horror to crimes that already defied comprehension. Hayes's discovery provided both hope for rescue and urgency for action, as shipping labels indicated the victims were scheduled for transport within 24 hours, their survival dependent on swift intervention by law enforcement before they could be loaded into that sealed railway car for their final journey. The Whitfield brothers' carefully constructed world began to crumble when they realized the extent of the investigation closing around them, their practiced calm giving way to barely concealed panic as they attempted to accelerate their departure plans while maintaining the facade of normalcy. Workers reported frantic activity in the restricted areas of the carnival as equipment was hastily packed and evidence destroyed, with several witnesses observing documents being burned in metal drums behind the main office. Cornelius Whitfield's commanding presence wavered as he barked contradictory orders, while Mordecai's nervous disposition escalated into near hysteria as he supervised the loading of certain special crates onto wagons. Sheriff Webb, anticipating their attempted flight, had already positioned his deputies and armed volunteers at key points around the town, creating a blockade that would prevent the carnival from leaving without inspection. The confrontation came at dawn when the carnival's wagons attempted to depart under cover of early morning mist, only to find their path blocked by armed lawmen who demanded full inspection of all vehicles and railway cars. The scene that followed was chaos as carnival workers, many genuinely innocent of their employers' crimes, reacted with confusion and fear to the sudden law enforcement action. Some workers, realizing they had been unwitting accomplices to murder, immediately cooperated with authorities, eager to distance themselves from the horrors they were only now beginning to understand. Others, more deeply implicated or bound by threats and blackmail, attempted to resist or flee, leading to brief but intense confrontations that saw several arrests and one exchange of gunfire that left a carnival strongman wounded. The Whitfield brothers themselves attempted to maintain their innocence, with Cornelius producing documents that he claimed proved their legitimate business operations, while Mordecai descended into babbling protests about persecution and misunderstanding. Their performance might have been more convincing had Sheriff Webb not been armed with Eleanor Morrison's copied documents, Dr. Hayes's medical evidence, and the testimony of multiple witnesses who could no longer remain silent. As the sun rose over Lawton, illuminating a scene of wagons surrounded by armed men and carnival workers being sorted into those who would be released and those who would be arrested, it became clear that the Whitfield brothers' traveling chamber of horrors had reached its final stop. The sealed railway car stood silent and imposing, its secrets about to be revealed to a world that would struggle to comprehend the evil that had traveled the rails disguised as family entertainment. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the certainty of the hangman's noose, Cornelius Whitfield's carefully maintained composure finally shattered in a confession that revealed the full scope of their operations in clinical detail that shocked even the hardened lawmen who heard it. Speaking in the measured tones of a businessman discussing quarterly profits rather than mass murder, he explained how he and his brother had built their enterprise over 7 years, starting with grave robbing and body snatching before realizing that fresher specimens commanded higher prices from medical colleges and private collectors who asked few questions about provenance. Their selection process, he revealed with disturbing pride, had been refined to target those least likely to be missed or searched for: orphans aging out of institutions, drifters seeking work, prostitutes, and runaway youth, whose disappearances would be attributed to the harsh realities of frontier life rather than foul play. The carnival provided perfect cover, offering employment to potential victims who could be evaluated for their specimen value, while also bringing a steady stream of visitors from whom select targets could be identified and acquired. He spoke of their relationship with Dr. Magnus Crow in Chicago as a business partnership that had proven mutually beneficial, with Crow providing medical knowledge about preservation techniques and anatomy, while serving as their primary buyer for both preserved specimens and occasional live subjects for his private research. The confession included details about their network of contacts in other states, morgue attendants who could be bribed to look the other way, medical students who served as scouts for interesting specimens, and even other traveling shows that occasionally participated in the trade. Cornelius showed no remorse as he discussed their victims, viewing them purely as merchandise, whose value lay in their physical uniqueness or the quality of their preservation, noting with pride that their specimens were considered superior to those obtained through traditional body snatching because of their freshness and the care taken in their preparation. He revealed the existence of detailed records hidden in multiple locations that documented every transaction, every victim, and every buyer, information he offered to trade for considerations in his sentencing, though Sheriff Webb made it clear that no deal would spare him from justice. The younger brother Mordecai's confession was less coherent but equally damning, delivered through tears and claims that Cornelius had forced him to participate, though his intimate knowledge of the killing procedures and evident skill in the workshop suggested willing participation rather than coercion. Together, their confessions painted a picture of entrepreneurial evil that had transformed murder into a business model, complete with supply chains, quality control, and customer satisfaction guarantees that would have been admirable in any legitimate enterprise, but were horrifying when applied to the systematic harvesting of human beings. The investigation into Dr. Magnus Crow and his Chicago operation revealed a network of horror that extended far beyond the Whitfield brothers' traveling carnival, encompassing multiple suppliers and a clientele that included some of the nation's most respected medical institutions. When federal marshals raided Crow's facility, operating under the guise of a medical supply company, they discovered a warehouse of nightmares that confirmed the worst suspicions about the scope of the body trade. The sealed railway car, when finally opened under armed guard, contained 37 preserved specimens awaiting shipment, each carefully catalogued with documentation that attempted to legitimize their origins through forged death certificates and fabricated medical histories. Among these were remains that could be matched to missing persons reports from across the Midwest, finally providing closure to families who had wondered for years about the fate of their loved ones. Timothy Hartwell and Deputy William Foster, rescued from the workshop by Dr. Hayes, survived their ordeal, though both required extensive medical treatment to recover from the effects of the drugs and trauma they had endured. 2 other victims found with them, a young woman from Arkansas and a teenage boy from Kansas, were also saved, though their families had already given them up for dead. The documentation seized from various locations revealed that over 40 people had fallen victim to the Whitfield brothers' operation across multiple states, though investigators suspected the actual number was higher, given the incomplete nature of the records and the likelihood that some victims had never been reported missing. The network extended beyond Dr. Crow to include buyers at several medical colleges who had knowingly purchased illegally obtained specimens, choosing to ask no questions about the remarkably fresh cadavers that arrived with unusual regularity. Private collectors, some of them prominent citizens who maintained secret cabinets of anatomical curiosities, were also implicated, their names causing scandals that rippled through social circles from Chicago to New York. The investigation revealed that similar operations were running in other parts of the country, with traveling carnivals, medicine shows, and even theatrical troupes serving as cover for body-snatching rings that had operated with impunity due to the limited communication between law enforcement agencies and the general assumption that missing persons in the frontier territories had simply moved on to seek their fortunes elsewhere. The Whitfield case became a catalyst for new legislation regarding the handling of human remains and stricter oversight of anatomical specimen acquisition by medical institutions, though the full extent of the trade would never be completely uncovered, as many involved in peripheral roles disappeared rather than face investigation. The trial of the Whitfield brothers became a sensation that drew journalists from across the nation, transforming the Lawton courthouse into a circus of its own, as reporters competed to capture every lurid detail for readers hungry to understand how such evil could operate undetected for so long. The prosecution, led by a team of federal and state attorneys, presented evidence that was both overwhelming and horrifying, including testimony from survivors who described their ordeals in voices that trembled with remembered terror, photographs of the killing chamber and preservation workshop that caused several jurors to request recesses, and the brothers' own business records that reduced human lives to profit margins. Eleanor Morrison's testimony proved particularly powerful. Her clear recitation of the evidence she had gathered while risking her life inside the carnival, bringing several spectators to tears as she described finding Timothy Hartwell's name in the ledger of victims. Dr. Hayes provided expert medical testimony that explained the technical aspects of the crimes while never losing sight of their human cost, his professional demeanor cracking only when he described finding the sedated victims awaiting their transformation into specimens. The defense attorneys, faced with overwhelming evidence and their clients' own confessions, could only argue for mercy based on claims of mental illness, suggesting that the brothers' complete lack of empathy indicated minds diseased rather than evil. This argument fell flat when Cornelius took the stand in his own defense and displayed a clarity of thought and recall that suggested perfect awareness of his actions' moral implications, which he simply chose to ignore in favor of profit. The Carnival's innocent employees testified about the climate of fear that had prevented them from speaking out, describing threats both explicit and implied that had kept them silent, even as they suspected something terrible was happening in the restricted areas of the show. Several revealed they had been blackmailed with fabricated evidence of crimes or threatened with becoming specimens themselves if they showed too much curiosity about their employer's activities. The jury's deliberation was brief, returning guilty verdicts on all charges after less than 3 hours of discussion, their faces grim as they filed back into the courtroom to deliver justice for victims who could no longer speak for themselves. Both brothers were sentenced to hang, the judge's words emphasizing that their systematic approach to murder and their complete lack of remorse placed them beyond any possibility of rehabilitation or mercy, though appeals would delay their execution for several months as their attorneys pursued every legal avenue available. 1 year after the Whitfield brothers' execution and the disbanding of their Carnival of Horrors, Lawton still struggled to return to normalcy as the community grappled with the trauma of having hosted such evil within their boundaries. The carnival grounds remained abandoned, local residents refusing to build or farm on land they considered tainted by the blood of victims and the presence of that underground killing chamber, which had been filled in, but whose location was still known to those who remembered. Parents found themselves more protective of their children, no longer taking for granted the safety of a small town where everyone knew everyone, while the arrival of any traveling show or carnival was met with suspicion that took years to fade. Dr. Hayes published a groundbreaking paper on medical ethics that used the Whitfield case to argue for stricter standards in anatomical procurement and the need for physicians to question the sources of specimens used in education and research. His work contributed to new regulations that required detailed documentation of cadaver origins and created oversight committees to prevent medical institutions from becoming complicit in murder through willful ignorance. Eleanor Morrison, her courage during the investigation having earned her widespread admiration, compiled a comprehensive memorial list of all known victims, working with families across multiple states to ensure that those who had been reduced to inventory numbers in the Whitfield ledgers were remembered as individuals with names, stories, and people who mourned their loss. She established a scholarship fund for the education of orphans and runaways, recognizing that these vulnerable populations had been the brothers' primary targets and deserving of protection and opportunity rather than predation. Sheriff Webb maintained correspondence with law enforcement agencies across the frontier, sharing information about similar operations and helping to establish protocols for investigating suspicious disappearances associated with traveling entertainments. His efforts led to the exposure of 3 other body-snatching rings operating under various covers, though none approached the scale or organization of the Whitfield brothers' operation. Timothy Hartwell and the other survivors struggled with the psychological aftermath of their ordeal, with young Timothy requiring years of therapy to overcome nightmares and anxiety that stemmed from his time in that workshop of horrors. Foster returned to duty after his physical recovery, but found himself changed by the experience, more vigilant and perhaps more cynical about human nature, though also more determined to protect those who could not protect themselves. The sealed railway car that had carried so many victims to their final destinations was destroyed in a public ceremony. Its metal melted down and formed into a memorial bell that would ring each year on the anniversary of the rescue, a sound that served both as remembrance for the lost and warning that such evil must never be allowed to operate unchecked again. As years passed, the specific horrors of the Whitfield brothers' crimes faded from active memory, becoming history rather than lived experience. But the lessons learned from their exposure continued to influence law enforcement procedures, medical ethics, and community vigilance. The final image that remained in the collective memory of those who lived through those terrible days was not of the brothers themselves or their carnival of false wonders, but of a child's toy discovered in that abandoned railway car, a simple wooden horse that had belonged to some unknown victim, a reminder that behind every specimen number in those terrible ledgers was a human being who had been loved, who had played and laughed and dreamed before encountering monsters disguised as showmen, offering wonders beyond imagination but delivering only death.